All right, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second Connect series of the 2017-2018 academic year. My name is Brandon Clark. I'm a doctoral student in the Educational Leadership Organization and Policy Program in the School of Education at Iowa State University, and I serve as chair of the Division A Graduate Student Committee Connect series. The Connect series is an initiative sponsored by the ARA Division A Graduate Student Committee, which features a sequence of virtual real-time sessions broadcast monthly during the school year. Each session features different scholar practitioner panelists and focus on a unique theme related to educational leadership.
Brandon,
real-time sessions broadcast monthly during the school year.
So
Each session
just a
features
little
different
caveat
scholar
to all the
practitioner
presenters.
panelists. Focus on a unique theme
Can you
related to
also
educational
mute
leadership.
yourself while other people are talking?
Is that better? Go ahead and say that again. Sorry, we're having issues. Wei Ling. Wei Ling.
He was just telling us to mute ourselves so that we wouldn't have feedback.
Oh, okay.
While
Perfect.
you were talking. So like when one person is talking, everyone else should be muted. And I guess I didn't listen to do that. So.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Good idea. All right. So I guess back to where I was, the theme of today is educational leadership and intersectionality. So we're going to focus a lot on what is intersectionality, how does intersectionality apply to educational leadership research, and then how can intersectionality use enhance school leadership and preparation practices and policies. Today we are fortunate to have joining us Dr. Lisa Bass and Dr. Martin Scanlan.
Are you muted now, Brandon?
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna, Wei Ling, would you like to talk about some graduate student news? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna, Wei Ling, would you like to talk about some graduate student news?
Okay, can y'all hear me? Sorry about the delay, and I just wanted to introduce
Wei Ling, would you like to talk about some graduate student news? We lose Wei, I think we lost Wei Ling. Can you hear me? Okay. I think it looks like we might have lost Wei Ling, so maybe we'll just pick up and just talk about, jump into the conversation on intersectionality until she gets back. Does that work for both of you? Okay, so Dr. Bass, would you like to start off by introducing yourself and kind of talking about some of your scholarly interests and some of the current work that you've been engaging, perhaps around intersectionality or anything else for that matter?
Yes, so I'm Lisa Bass from North Carolina State University. And I think the piece that you all picked up on where I addressed intersectionality was when I was writing on the ethics of caring and leadership. And I mentioned how race and gender impacted ed leadership and how people perceive care and then how they show care in their schools. See, I have a blank screen. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I still do work, and that was a few years ago, but I still do work mainly on the ethics of caring, and actually most recently, actually just today, submitted the UCEA book for ethics. That's the series on the standards is published by Routledge. So that was my most recent work, and I edited the text, so it was a lot of reading and meshing the text together. And my current research in the field is actually on leadership development and looking at people who were identified as Wells Fargo's Principals of the Year and doing a qualitative study on how they were trained. So I don't know if you all are familiar with the Wallace work, but NC State was one of the schools that received the grant. And so we're doing a big effort to kind of revise our curriculum and ed leadership. So I thought that that work would lend itself, you know, to helping contribute to that. So that's what I'm doing this present year, but still working in the ethics of caring and addressing issues of intersectionality as well.
That's excellent. We're super excited to have you on. Dr. Scanlan, can you maybe tell us a little bit about your research and interests in current projects?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Martin Scanlan, and I'm at Boston College and formerly at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And before that, elementary school administrator and teacher for a little over a decade in Washington, D.C., and in Oakland and in Madison, Wisconsin. Out of my practitioner experience, when I was doing my doctoral work in Madison, I got very interested in how people who are in leadership positions think about inclusivity across multiple dimensions. And I've continued the work that I started there, mostly in case study work, and looking at how service delivery models are organized to be inclusive across multiple dimensions of diversity and marginalization. My primary focus has been on how school and district level leaders think about the inclusion of kids with disabilities and other exceptionalities, and how we think about inclusion across cultural and linguistic diversity. But I've also been attending to all the other dimensions of identity that come into play. And around intersectionality, along with George Theoharis at Syracuse University, had a series of publications a few years ago on, first in the Theory into Practice as a journal, and then an edited book with Routledge, really looking at, explicitly looking at the intersectionality. So this has been a longstanding interest of mine back from my days as a teacher and administrator up until the present. Currently, some of my very current work that I'm doing involves looking at refugee students and how schools and districts are organized around serving refugee students, so that a particular kind of student that is on the rise around the world and has cultural and linguistic diversity in particular pronounced, but also racial diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, all kind of dimensions of the refugee experience. And so that's one example of where intersectionality is coming into my current work. And the other current work that I'm involved with most recently involves thinking about universal design for learning, UDL, and principles of UDL, and how schools are organized to scaffold the knowledge of teachers and administrators in implementing UDL. So the principles of UDL are also kind of central to thinking about intersectionality, because they emphasize thinking about designing the curriculum and instruction and the teaching and learning experience with foregrounding access and reducing barriers.
Thank you for that. It's great to have both of you on. Wei Ling, can you hear me? Are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, good. Before we jump in, then I think to a little deeper conversation on this idea or on the concepts of intersectionality, Wei Ling, did you want to make a couple of announcements?
Yes. First of all, I wanted to thank both Professor Dr. Bass and Dr. Scanlan and sharing your experience and your current research with all the graduate students in Division A. And second, I wanted to thank everybody who's participating, but I don't. And just later on, feel free to ask questions. And hopefully, if you have any technology issues, feel free to contact me or Brendan. And there are a couple of announcements that I wanted to bring all the audience's attention. Is first of all, we are starting to post some news on our graduate student corner in a newsletter. So if you wanted to know more about what Division A Graduate Student Committee are doing, you can definitely Google it, and then you can find out that there are some recent posts that we've been working on. And we also have Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And so if you wanted to follow us and see what's the current events going on, then you should follow us on Twitter and Facebook. The next coming up event is we're now announcing with Division L and UCA, we're announcing the nomination for Clark Seminar. So if you are in process of working on your dissertation proposal or in any of the stage of your dissertation process, then I do encourage students to apply, and it's a great experience. You get to connect with all the professors that's in your own field. And so other than that, that's pretty much it so far, and enjoy the rest of the conversations with the two great professors. And everybody, please also say thank you to Brendan. He's been doing such a great job organizing the Connect series. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody.
Thank you, Wei Ling. All right. So I guess what we'll do now is go ahead and just to get into some questions. So I'll pose just I guess we'll start out like I think a lot of times the term intersectionality can become perhaps ambiguous, and so from both of your research and experience and expertise, what does intersectionality mean? How can we think about it in doing research, and then also in leadership practice? That's kind of a broad question, but perhaps one of you would like to go ahead and start off.
I'll go ahead and get started. To me, when I hear intersectionality, I think complexity. And it's a term used when we can't pinpoint exactly what the contributing factors were when we look at outcomes. So we look at everything that we think it could be, and then we say, okay, these competing factors or things that exist together or coexist together all contribute to it, versus trying to pinpoint an actual cause for any particular thing or outcome that we're looking at in leadership or in schools. So if you're looking at student achievement, you might say, well, is it race? Is it gender? Is it disability? What are the factors that contribute to achievement gaps and, lack of achievement in schools? If you really want to be honest and get a full answer, you have to think of, all of the competing factors, and intersectionality is a term that can be used. This is just an example to really look at why something, is occurring in schools.
So I'd build on what Dr. Bass is talking about there in terms of the complexity, and I'll talk about pinpointing causes. So sometimes we think about, like tonight when I was working in a class, I was teaching a graduate class tonight called Family and Community Engagement. And we were reading an article actually by another Division A member. So we were reading an article by Terrence Green, and Terrence was talking about community-based equity audits. So an equity audit is a tool that that we think about as a kind of a very straightforward tool to surface where are there inequities, and as Dr. Bass was talking about, well, how do we pinpoint different kind of causes for those inequities? And in Dr. Green's article, he talks about moving from equity audits to community-based equity audits, where you're not just looking at the school, but looking at the broader community. When we think about intersectionality, we need to have specific ways in which we operationalize that, where we look at the different dimensions of identity and the different disproportionalities that exist in our schools that relate to disproportionate opportunities to learn. And so there's multiple dimensions of identity, and when we think about the whole person, we're thinking about those. When we think about ourselves, and we think about our kiddos and our colleagues, our teachers, and our parents and families, they're not just kind of one dimension. It's not just the racial identity or the ethnic identity and the linguistic heritage. And these are not just stable either. They're shifting over time and how we think about these. So when we think about how we have our own racial identity formation, how does that shift over time? And we think about our own sexuality, and so these are different dimensions of identity. And as a school leader, you can't just look at one single dimension. You have to pay attention to the complexity. When we think about our schools, we have to pay attention to the complexity. That's difficult to do. And so in our leadership development and in our research, when we're trying to understand different issues in schools and in school systems, having a way of talking about that complexity is essential. And intersectionality provides that entry point.
And for the visual people, I was just thinking as you were talking, just thinking of overlapping spheres of influence. So Venn diagrams that just overlap with all of the contributing factors that we may come up with could be a visual you could use to kind of understand intersectionality.
So I guess what I'm hearing say is this idea of, so I think what gets sometimes confusing, so intersectionality as a paradigm, as a framework, as an analytical tool, where kind of does it fit in that does it fit in a category, or is it more this idea of intersectionality, is it more broadly applicable to studying, I guess, power relations and relations between different identities and where these identities intersect and whatnot. So I guess how is it typically employed within research? Is it a tool, paradigm?
So think about, I talked about the class that I was teaching tonight. So I'm just going to ground it in that because that was what's on my mind. So we're talking about family and community engagement, okay? And so if you're a school leader, a practitioner, and you're thinking, how do I foster authentic partnerships with family and communities? Or if you're a scholar and you're working on your doctoral studies and you're thinking, I'd like to examine some dimension of that, some aspect of family community engagement, okay? So whatever approach you're taking, from a practitioner or a research approach to that topic, family and community engagement, think about intersectionality as a way to frame how are you thinking about families. So how is a family defined? Is it, well, you're thinking about different kinds of identities of parents. There's different kinds of family structures there's different kinds of individuals who parent within a family. There are different dimensions of identity that come into play in those families. Their own structure as a family, how they identify racially and ethnically, their linguistic and cultural heritage and background, and other dimensions that may come into play. Their religious identity, for instance. Where they see themselves situated in the community, their immigration status. All of these are different aspects of their identity. And so if you're thinking about family and community engagement, you're not just thinking, all I got to think about is engaging families more. You got to think about those individuals in their complexity, and those different dimensions of identity intersect in complex ways. And so you need some language to talk about that as a school principal, to think about that as a school principal, or to think about that as a scholar studying that. And intersectionality provides some language toward surfacing some of that complexity that Dr. Bass was referencing.
If you want to think about a research design, you can think about those complex relationships that may emerge from a lit review or just from your own knowledge of the subject, and include all of those topics or all of those dimensions as you go out to collect your data. Just acknowledging all of the features and factors that could, contribute to whatever outcome you're trying to study. So for example, for my dissertation many years ago, several years ago, I studied social capital, cultural capital, and education capital, and the impact that that would have in a boarding school environment on academic achievement, particularly for underachieving students. So that's an example of how intersectionality, and back then I didn't use the term intersectionality, but now having that as a framework in my mind, I could have used that as as a way to explain my data and a way to explain, the framework or the concepts that I was studying. So you can use it to frame or to guide your study if you know in advance what they are. And then also on the back end, if you're looking at explaining in your chapter 4, in your analysis, you can use intersectionality to explain your data if you didn't know that going in. So there's 2 ways you can use it in research.
Perfect. That makes sense. I think a lot of times we hear intersectionality. It gets. I think some of the folks have talked about it being used as kind of a buzzword, in that it gets used, but we don't exactly know what it means to do intersectionality or to do intersectional analysis or try to make meaning or understanding through an intersectional lens. So with that in mind, how does intersectionality play out in social justice? I mean, can you have social justice without intersectionality? Or the way that we're looking at social justice now, is intersectionality an important component of social justice agenda, especially for school leaders?
Well, I think by definition, social justice is intersectionality, because if you look at Theo Harris's definition, which is very widely used in ed leadership, it's just acknowledging race, gender, culture, differences, all of that in your leadership. And that's really sitting at the intersection of your position as a school leader and considering all of those factors in your leadership. And I think it's also even considering yourself when you look at who you are as a person. Even if you're a white male or a white female or a black female or a black male, how does all of your components of who makes you, how you're made up, how does that contribute to your leadership? And then going into a building that is very diverse, looking at all the factors that you should consider, when making decisions in schools.
And where I'd build on what Dr. Bass is saying there, we think about in our discussions of social justice leadership and our quest as practitioners and as scholars to advance social justice, it's an ongoing quest. It's not something that you get and then we're done. We've got social justice. It's an ongoing. There's always inequities in different ways. And some of the inequities are things you see, and some of the inequities you're not even tuned into. You're not even recognizing. So, in our own lives, in our own leadership practice, and some of our biggest learnings are when some of those, our own blinders are made manifest to us. And we realize, wow, I didn't even realize that I was blind to that or unaware of that. I think about a doctoral student who, inadvertently, used a very pejorative language around students with disabilities, not trying to do so. They just came out of her. And so calling attention to that for her, this is a person who was extremely cognizant of dimensions of race and racism and white privilege. But all of a sudden, out of her mouth came something that was extremely offensive around students with exceptionalities. So calling attention to our own limitations and being humble about that, recognizing that we're all continuing to grow in our awareness of equity and inequity. Intersectionality provides a lens to think about that. So just for 30 more seconds on this, you think, how does this actually work in our language? Think about how we can essentialize certain categories. You can talk about a student who's Latino student. So you think we start talking about Latino students as if all Latino students are the same, when clearly they're not. And or even if you want to narrow it down and say a Mexican American student, and again, like clearly they're not all the same. And so none of us like to be put in those boxes, and all of us have blinders about the dimensions of awareness that we're paying attention to, or that are most salient to us. Intersectionality provides a way to talk about that, and you can surface what you are paying attention to. So and acknowledge that there's other dimensions of diversity and identity that you're paying less attention to. You can't pay attention to everything all the time at the same level. So being aware of that is an important aspect of it as well.
So with that, as you were talking, I was thinking, it sounds like you're saying that social justice is the process of acknowledging intersectionality, essentially.
A very insightful perspective on intersectionality, because I think, again, a lot of times you think of it, if you're not familiar with it, it can be, again, ambiguous, or we're not sure like what does it mean. But to see how you made that connection between it being procedural as a process rather than a kind of an end, and also as a way to, it is social justice, right? It's kind of what I'm hearing. So in preparing school leaders or even future researchers, I mean, what can school preparation programs for superintendents, I mean, teachers, anyone really, right, do to promote, do perhaps even a better job of incorporating intersectionality? I know from even my experiences and the experience of others that often social justice courses in general aren't a requirement in many cases. And when they are, a lot of times intersectionality is just again, a buzzword, or it's not covered in depth. It's talked about, but not at differing levels. So maybe what can schools of education do?
So yeah, so one response I have. So one of the things that I'm engaged with right now at Boston College with faculty is a working group of faculty members that's called Undoing Oppression in Our Curriculum and Pedagogy. Okay, and so we purposely chose the title Undoing Oppression because oppression is manifest in many different dimensions. And so when you think about undoing oppression, then you're automatically, it points toward intersectionality. And so when you raise questions, how do we undo oppression in our curriculum and pedagogy? It forces you to start to look at, well, where are there implicit biases in my own teaching, in my own classroom setting, in my own pedagogy? Where is there or limitations in the dimensions of racial diversity in the authors on which I'm drawing from? And those are just like two kind of very straightforward, kind of simple examples of starting to look at undoing oppression in curriculum and pedagogy. So framing it broadly, but then starting to look at specific dimensions of identity to operationalize that. In a conversation in one of these task force meetings, a colleague of mine talked about how his growing awareness of the importance of internationalization and drawing upon authors and scholarship from other countries is something that he's very intentional now in his syllabi to do that in a manner that I haven't been. And so he was calling attention to a different dimension of diversity that I wasn't really paying attention to. And so that those conversations can bring the awareness forward. And the last thing I'd say about this is that I think one way in which we operationalize intersectionality is by taking seriously a focus on specific dimensions of diversity. So foregrounding race and racism, for instance, is an important start. It's not the only dimension of oppression. So we're thinking about undoing oppression. Racism isn't the only one, but it's one way to start. And by starting and say, naming that, say, we're going to look at racism within our curriculum and pedagogy, not because that's the only dimension of oppression, because that's one place that we're starting, recognizing that there's many other dimensions, and we're going to start here. So ironically, I think one way to get toward intersectionality is by sometimes taking a narrow focus, looking at sexism, looking at heterosexism. So taking a narrow focus on some dimensions of diversity.
And I would say that in addition to that, which this is included in this notion of self-reflection, reflectivity, and really digging deep, into who you are as a leader. So facilitating activities in your classes that require people to really think of who they are as a leader, who they are as a person, and why they are that way. We have an alternative licensure program that we actually get to take students away, off campus, and to do extra projects and to do retreats. And one of the retreats is called digital storytelling. And in that, they really dig deep, and they're coached into digging deep, to talk about, to actually do a video of who they are, where they came from, and then they can use that. They not only get closer and they get to know each other better, but they use that as a springboard to really find out who they are and why they are the way they are. And that helps you, before you try to dig into these deep concepts such as, racism, to know, why you may be racist or why you may have racist notions. It could, come from the way you were raised. So it really causes you to think deeper before going into those activities.
And just to build on that self-reflection piece that Dr. Bass is talking about, it reminds me of a presentation I heard at lunch today. Some colleagues in higher education, where they were getting ready for the ASH conference, and they were talking about their research on the impact of service learning experiences on campus. Students, doing alternate spring breaks where they're going to Appalachia, for instance, and having these immersion service experiences. And they're studying this. What's the effect on the students? What's persistent? So on and so forth. And the self-reflection that they were presenting, that the students were experiencing because of these immersion experiences, was really profound. It was making them aware not only, say, of their own, say, racial identity, as Dr. Bass is just talking about. They were also building like a relational awareness of mindsets that were really foreign to them. So in one of the excerpts that they had up there, a student was talking about how, and this was data from right after the presidential election, and they didn't understand how these Trump voters, they felt very foreign, they didn't understand these people. And then they were having this experience. One of the students was reflecting on this in a Appalachian town that went for Trump, and they said they never had understood it before, but they, in a way, they saw the desolation of this rural white community, and all of a sudden, for the first time, I can see how some of these notions, as abhorrent as they were, how some of these notions took root in this community. So it was self-reflective about themselves, but also it didn't justify, it didn't make it right, but it actually put a relationship on some dimensions of diversity. In this case, it was political diversity, as well as some socioeconomic diversity, and certainly cultural diversity that they didn't have. They didn't have the tools to reflect on that. So I think what Dr. Bass is saying about self-reflection involves both how we look at ourselves and also what experiences we're engaged in that put us in conversation with the other. And what dimensions of other are you thinking about? Well, there's the intersectionality piece.
Yeah, that was really, so thinking about this so what I'm hearing is this importance. If we're to engage in intersectionality or social justice work, it's important first for us to engage in kind of self work or self reflection, understand how we exist, our positionalities in relation to, I guess, those we work with, interact with. I mean, that's kind of sound like a fundamental component of being socially just is being able to reflect on yourself first, and then being able to try or attempt to recognize systems of oppression and unequal power relations and things like that. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
I would say that's accurate. And also, I did my edited book on Black masculine caring, and that reflective piece was really big as I did my own research first and did focus groups. The men, before they could talk about their caring and how they cared and why they cared, they would talk about their own experiences as Black men, and then how that in turn impacted how they cared for students and how they cared for other people for that matter. So I agree 100%.
I just would push on one thing that you're saying there, Brent. It is definitely the self-reflection piece. But I think inherent in when we talk about social justice leadership is a critical self-reflection. And so that involves getting uncomfortable, and that requires some agency on our parts in looking at our own privilege and the dimensions of privilege that we kind of are aware of, and also putting ourselves in positions where we're forced to listen to and hear what might be challenging to us, and what makes us uncomfortable. I think so. Part of that self-reflection also entails is a critical awareness and an openness to growth that it's going to require a fair degree of getting uncomfortable. I think part of becoming a social justice leader is exposing yourself to that, is challenging yourself to that, inviting those critical friends to help you with that. So it is definitely the self-reflection, but I just would push on it is it's not just kind of it's not a comfortable experience of just looking at myself and kind of thinking about it. Although not to minimize that, that is important, and safety and having a safe place, all of that's important. But it's also important, the critical component.
And one other thing I think is really important is, I think you mentioned that you don't have a social justice class. One of the things that we're considering in our redesign is the fact that it should be embedded in every class. You can't just say, okay, this is your social justice class and then forget about it. You have to think about, how does it apply to school and community relations? How does it apply to school culture? How does it apply to teacher empowerment? So not just, putting it in one little box, but really thinking about it in terms of your whole life and your whole practice, where social justice belongs.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about intersectionality. So in that sense, the degree to which within our leadership preparation programs we can be intentional about integrating the multiple dimensions of diversity and attending to promoting equitable opportunities to learn and attending to the multiple dimensions of diversity across the curriculum. That's a way to kind of foster intersectional thinking. And yeah, so
these are some excellent insights. I think it's just, you know, thinking about the importance, if we are to be socially just, the importance, like you said, Dr. Scanlan, about not only reflecting, but being uncomfortable and questioning ourselves and being critical, I think is important. Then also, how do we integrate social justice not only within a single class, but within a school program, within the pedagogy, within curriculum, with you know, within policies and classes. And that kind of going to let me segue into, so we have about 10 to 12 minutes left. I don't want to, we have some viewer questions that have been posed, and so I don't want to ignore those. So one of the questions is how can we introduce intersectionality when speaking with colleagues that are positioned at the center? So those who are white, heterosexual, male, American-born. How do we engage these things? I guess that's the question that's being posed here. Or what are some strategies, perhaps?
So, as a white, male, heterosexual, American-born individual, I can speak to how you do this, and my recommendation is that you do this directly, that you raise directly in conversation and relationships with your colleagues. And I have colleagues who identify across all sorts of dimensions of diversity, that you raise the issue of intersectionality directly, and you do directly within the context of what are we doing here. So when here at Boston College, we have conversations about educating for social justice and educating for meaning and purpose, and advancing the human imagination. This is part of what we talk about, is part of our mission. And so right there is introducing it right there as part of what we're about, is where we start talking about then the undoing oppression in our curriculum and pedagogy subcommittee that I was referencing earlier, and acknowledging and attending to our own racial identity, our own privilege, and the dimensions of privilege that are manifest on the campus and within the faculty and so forth, that's where we start with it, by thinking about what are we doing here, what are we about, and then calling it right out. And I think that in my experience, when you can ground the conversation in the mission of the institution, that's an important starting point. And to have those conversations directly is where you begin.
I think it's just as important, not only what you say, but how you say it, and to acknowledge who you are before you say it. And what I mean is, if you are an African-American or a Hispanic person, sometimes people won't hear it if you come across as very, very dogmatic. And I've had colleagues to say that, you know, they're saying, okay, we're going to have this conversation, because I think the conversation is being had on every campus in some form or another. But it was said in a meeting, well, you need to watch how you say, you know, that wasn't directed toward me, but it was as we were talking about how we would go about the work of talking about it more. So we're not to the point to where you are. We have had like one workshop where someone has come in, but we don't have it as, you know, as widely, and, you know, something is ongoing like you do. But it was said in a meeting, well, you better be careful how you say it, because we will turn off or shut it off if you come across too strongly. So, you know, if you are, like I said, if you are a person of color, you really have to watch the tone, even though it could be something you're very passionate about. That's all I wanted to say. It's just, yeah, you have to acknowledge who you are as a person with your approach.
So I'm kind of hearing from you, Dr. Bass, is this, you have to, sometimes we want to go at social justice. I don't know the right term, all out, just go for it. But we have to think, maybe perhaps think strategically about how we engage our interactions and how we engage, topics of intersectionality and social justice.
Exactly, something somewhat like the Malcolm X approach versus the Martin Luther King approach. What will people receive, even if you feel like going through, and like Matt Turner, you can't do that sometimes. You really have to take it and, be peaceful, but still deliver the message and be firm and strong in what you say.
I guess the other thing that's coming to mind as I listen to you, Dr. Bass, is two things. One, you mentioned starting, being mindful of yourself and your own identity. And so this relational piece. So I think as we're thinking about how to reach out to colleagues and to foster a community of practice that's committed to equity and undoing oppression and social justice and intersectional thinking, that it's important that we're fostering those relationships with one another, creating space to see and value and legitimately value one another, including those that we don't identify with necessarily. So practicing that is I think an important aspect of what I'm hearing you say, build in those relationships. The other thing that I was thinking as you were talking is a multi-pronged approach. So so we have different entry points. So this work that I've mentioned, this undoing oppression, we have some people that are committee members and we're doing a lot. And we have other people that attend an occasional brown bag lunch. And it's like a little commitment for them. We have other people that have committed to a year-long monthly seminar where they're really looking seriously with a group of 8 people at their own practices. So there's like committee members, and I'm going to show up for a brown bag lunch, and I'm going to commit to doing this every month for 2 hours for the year. So there's a multi-pronged approach, and I think that was also what's on my mind when you were talking.
And I think you mentioned the word value at some point, and I think that's a key in winning other people over. Because if you think about it, if you are at the center and you do have the privilege, it's just not natural to see it as beneficial to share your privilege, because it feels like you're losing something. You're losing an edge. But if you think about how much stronger the community can be if other people are empowered and they do add and realize that it really doesn't take away from you, institution stronger, and it makes, everyone stronger when everyone's voice can be heard. So I think if you can get people to see that you're not losing anything, but you're actually gaining something by hearing the voices of diverse peers, I think that's a point that we should take to.
I think Dr. Bass, and going with that too, we have just a couple minutes left, but there was a question posed on YouTube, and it asked, and thinking about voice, and the question was, why should we look at intersectionality when the literature relating to leadership theory does not give voice to the lived experiences of African American women leaders? Can you provide some insights on why it's important or not, or what can we do?
I can say that there is some literature that, where it is addressed, and I have like one piece on it, and I know that there are other people that I drew from to get the piece. But yeah, first of all, look at what's already been done, and then see that dearth or that hole that you see as justification for pursuing it further. So if you see holes like that, then that's your opportunity to say, hey, I don't see enough from African American leaders and African American women leaders in particular. So I want to do my work on that as well.
So I guess address it as a gap. If we're not seeing the voice, that is basically essentially looking at that's using intersectionalities when you're as a tool from when we began the conversation of identifying where I guess the voices are, or who's not being accounted for.
Yeah, and African American women leaders are diverse. It's not one, oh, now I'm talking about African American women leaders. Now that's a you can't essentialize that. So there's a tremendous amount of diversity among, I mean, think about I'm thinking about the African American women leaders that I've worked with here over the last few years. And the diversity of their identities and the diversity of their lived experiences and the diversity of their school content. And so it invites intersectionality. It's not like, well, I can either talk about intersectionality or I can talk about African American women leaders. No, intersectionality gives you a way to think about a particular group that would identify with these dimensions of identity: African American women leader. Those are 3 dimensions of identity. And you can foreground that. You can highlight that. You can say, this is a gap, and I want to do my research here. And at the same time, you can say, and I'm going to be thinking about intersectionality here as I'm looking at these people they're all going to, fit under these 3 labels. But there's also intersectionality in my thinking there. Recognizing that is the point.
And that reminds me of Letitia Reed's dissertation. And I believe she did some publishing on it, but she described the women that she studied as like different kinds of shoes. So yeah, it was kind of funny, but it was very true. She said some people are like sneakers, some people are like high heels, and just different types of shoes, but they were all women leaders. So that definitely proves that point.
Well, thank you both very much. I think we could certainly talk about intersectionality for 45 minutes is definitely not enough time. But I think you provided us a very this understanding of how intersectionality and social justice are one and the same. How the importance of reflection in our leadership and our research, and then also this idea of not essentializing groups based on one identity or more as one category, that we really need to use an intersectional lens to better understand these unique experiences and the diversity that exists among groups of people. So I would like to, on behalf of the ARA Division A Graduate Committee, just thank you both for your time and for volunteering to share your expertise with us. And if you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to leave us with as well, that'd be great.
I just commend you for this work, and thank you for what you're doing, all of you, you Brandon, but all of you in this.
Yes, and I'd like to thank you for your invitation. I've enjoyed the conversation and just talking about the topic again. And Brandon, just to tell you that you are very articulate and very perceptive in what we're saying. I felt like you just were listening and pulled everything together very well. So excellent facilitation skills.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Bass. That's very nice. Thank you. To everyone out there who's viewing, thank you very much for taking the time to out of your Wednesday evening to view in, and look for the next Division A Connect series, which will be on November 29th. And it's tentatively scheduled for 7 p.m. and we'll be sending out some information to ARA members regarding the topic and potential panelists. But in the meantime, thank you very much.
We'll see you all at UCEA, all of you that go and attend out in Denver, and come to the Social Justice, Leadership for Social Justice business meeting, the Special Interest Group business meeting, 7 a.m. Saturday morning.
Woo!
That's an intersectional approach.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for your time.
All right. Bye-bye. Good night.
Good evening. Bye-bye.